That was weird. That was weird. That was really weird. What happened there was a guest came up, and the normal features that allow me to either keep somebody on or take them down was just not available. So that was really odd, wasn't it? Anyway, it's an adventure here on TikTok. Somebody says I wanted a burger. Yeah, I guess the food there looked tasty, right? We'll see. All right, let's get some more people. Yeah, thanks for liking the live. But before we get started on the next chapter of this, if everybody could please just I'm going to do it too. Let's try to share this with others. The best way to do that is just to hold the screen down for like a half a second, and your list of your mutual friends will pop up, and then you can invite them. I'm going to do that too while we wait here. So please do that. It tells me in a list who's doing it too. So I'm going to invite people. So please just do your part and invite some people, please. We had 350 people before we had to stop, unfortunately. If you're someone who is pro-Israel and you want to make your points heard, or you want to challenge some of the things that I've spoken about, please come up. You have my word that you will be treated respectfully. You will be given ample time to share what you'd like to share. And then we'll have a conversation without interrupting one another. I think that's the best way to do this. So I welcome anybody who would like to come up who happens to be pro-Israel. If you're someone in the audience, and some people are very reluctant to come up, which is understandable if they're not used to talking to a crowd. But it's really easy. Just, say what you want to say. You don't have to have your camera on. Just imagine you're talking to a friend down the street at a bus stop or at the grocery store or whatever. It's all good. Now, there are lives you go on sometimes, and people will just ruthlessly treat you like you're less than. It's just not good. But that's just not how it works here. So what I don't want to do, just to let you know, I don't want to have a conversation as an echo chamber. I've done these lives before where we have 7 people on the panel, and all they're doing is criticizing Israel. It's not really worth anything, right? It's just we're repeating what we've already said to each other 1,000 times over. It's just not really that good. I know the audience enjoys it more when we get sort of a good back and forth, which is why I would like to try to do it that way. Okay, so if you could, please tap on me. We're going to get the lives up to 5,000 before we start out. It'll bring some more people in. Somebody wants me to talk about Al-Shifa. I talked about it earlier, but of course, Fauzi, I can't bring you up, man. Sorry, you were at that restaurant thing. Whoever that was is trying to disrupt the live. Somebody says they have a hard time listening to Zionists, to be honest. Shelley Irish. I get it. It's not always fun to hear somebody else's point of view, especially when they emphasize things that are not true. And they're repeating stuff that they've been told to say, which are not accurate. But it's also interesting to reveal the things that people are indoctrinated into. And I think the more that they speak, the easier it is to identify those things and then point it out for what it is. So in a way, I don't enjoy listening to them say it, but I enjoy responding to what they're saying. And as long as they're willing to go back and forth without cutting each other off, I really enjoy it. I think it's fair. What I don't like is when people come on and they start calling you names or saying you're an idiot or a moron or whatever. I can say that to anybody. It'd be silly. Yeah, I know the 40 baby story. A lot of the things that happen on these lives. And listen, this is the hard part too. When people make disparaging comments to you based on your point of view, they'll say like, "Oh, you just don't know. You're naive." I was called naive by this person yesterday. And, so I sent them some information to look at. They sent me some videos. I watched every single one. I responded accordingly based on what I saw, try to interact in a good faith manner. I sent her one video. She didn't look at it, wouldn't look at it, wouldn't respond to it. So when you finally get to a point with somebody like that who's not acting in good faith, you just got to leave them alone. Got to leave them alone. It's just not worth it. What the kind of people we want to reach are those who are open-minded, critical thinkers who are willing to engage with information. And so I know that we don't want to challenge our beliefs in many cases. It's hard to do that because, what we believe is like part of our identity. But if you liberate yourself from that constraint, which means you just say, okay, I know I thought this, but whatever comes next is what comes next. It's a much more genuine way to be, a more honest way to be, and actually quite a more fun way to be. Because you don't have to come from a point of view. You just go where the information takes you, and tell people you can be wrong. That's a lot of us are going to be wrong at this. Okay, again, I'm trying to get somebody to come up who's pro-Israel. I think the guests that are in the queue are pro-Palestine, and I just don't want to have an echo chamber for a conversation. Why don't they say people like to stay ignorant? I think they like to cling to what they believe they know because it's a comfort zone. I think that's a better way to put it. Now, I don't think anybody thinks they're ignorant. I've never met somebody that said, here's what I believe, and I know I'm ignorant and wrong. It just doesn't happen. So Coastal Concepts Agency, LLC, you say you're pro-Israel? Come on up. Talk. I'd love to have you come up and talk. You have enough followers to do it. And, by all means, please come up. Do you know where the guest request button is? It's just right of center. It's the little red and blue thing. If you request, I can bring you up, but I can't bring you up without. Oh, let me see if I can. I might be able to give you an invite. Let me see. Coastal. Trying to find you in the audience list. So far, you're not appearing. Unfortunately, I do not see you in the audience list, but I'm going to invite some other people while we're here doing this. So if you request to come up, Coastal, I can bring you up. I'd be happy to. And you will be given unfettered opportunity as long as you're not doing stuff that's personal or, crude and gross. Just make your points. I'm happy to have you come up and say whatever you want. I'm just inviting some more folks. Just a sec. Here we go. Okay. Yeah, come on up. It's fun to talk. Listen, you're very rarely are you going to find a live like this where, fair to you and not give you a hard time. Fair. And by the way, I didn't know this, but when you, as the host, when you invite people, it automatically is like inviting a guest to the audience, to the the screen. So anyway, so yeah, if you want to come up, please do. Okay, I'll tell you what I'll do. I think everybody here right now is pro-Palestinian. So if you're pro-Pally, just for now, can you please drop out of the guest request? I don't want to knock you out. I just really want to get somebody up who wants to speak about their point of view that's different from the dominant audience, if we can get it that way. And then I'll bring you up later, I promise, if you want to talk. I promise. Anyway, the last question that was asked was how would I do things differently? So let me continue that thought. So the question that was asked was, how would I have responded differently if I were Israel to what happened on 10/7? We talked about that. And I wouldn't have used so many munitions so cavalierly in civilian areas, one. I wouldn't go through with my military and unalive people unnecessarily who are civilians, two. I wouldn't have just randomly blown stuff up that had nothing to do with the military operation just because destroying mosques and schools and universities and stuff like that have been destroyed. The entire northern part of Gaza has been flattened. People said turned into a parking lot. They have. Oh, good. Coastal's being invited up. Yeah, Coastal, come on up. I'd be happy to speak with you. So that's what I would not do those things. I would go with special forces. I would try to enter the tunnels, as difficult as it is. I would have to bear the casualties of that, which is going to be very difficult to justify politically at home, and go where the enemy is, not punish civilians because you can't get to the enemy like the Americans did in Vietnam. The Vietnamese, the Viet Cong fighters used tunnels to pop up, engage the U.S. military, and pop back down. So they were hard to get to, hard to find. It's like fighting ghosts, as they would say. And then they would get so angry they would go into civilian villages not knowing who is who. Like Israel says, we don't know who's who, so we just do what we do and hope for the best. But that's callous indifference for human life, right? And that's not okay. So right now I'm just looking for a pro-Israeli guest. If you're somebody who's pro-Palestine, I'm not going to keep you up. So if you're asking and you're pro-Palestine, I'm not going to bring up guests for that right now. So somebody was asking me, it's about my mindset. Let me see what they said here. Some of the comments are knocked out. So Hitomi13X says it comes from your mindset chip. I'm not really sure what you mean by it comes or what that is. But I don't believe that what Israel has chosen to do is the right thing to do. They could do it because they have the backing of the U.S. financially, militarily, politically, the whole 9 yards. You know the deal. But they didn't have to do it this way. And there are probably Israelis at home that didn't agree with the totality of the operation. They probably say, yeah, hey, this is making us look bad. No, I was not in Vietnam. I was born in 1967, so I would have been a relatively unprepared combatant at the age of 3 months. But even if you try to justify it, when you kill 30,000 people, 40,000 people, when five or 600 of your civilians, not your military, were unalived by the enemy, because many of the civilians were unalived by the military response, crossfire, vehicle fire, helicopters, tanks, blah, blah, blah. So that's a disproportionate response. You can't justify that big a response. I mean, come on. If somebody else responded to your aggression that way, you'd be crying bloody murder. Like, oh my God, this is a second genocide. How can this be allowed to happen? Never again, right? You were crying that way about what happened on the 7th. Understandably so. I mean, I don't begrudge anybody who's calling it out for what it was. But the magnitude of the response is absurd. It's obscene. Okay, enough about that. We know that's the case. So somebody said, what's the solution to all this? Well, first of all, it's not an easy thing. I can say it, but it's a lot harder to do it. And some of the things that should happen are not going to be politically practical to happen. Now, what should ideally happen is this entire thing, this entire project should be undone. Okay, and by saying that, I do not mean the unaliving of people who live in the territory that's currently delineated as the state of Israel. I don't mean the people. I mean the border, the concept, the ideology that drives it, the settler colonial ethno-state aspect. It would be ideal if none of this ever occurred, because the amount of strife and consternation and violence, and it's been a disaster from the beginning. And anytime you try to force something on a group of people that don't want it forced on them, you get this kind of stuff. You get a lot of, it's like beating the side of a hornet's nest. What's the point? But that's not going to happen. That's a done deal at this point. Unless there's all-out conflict, which I doubt there will be, that's not going to change. I get that. I'm not a moron. But the 1967 thing is very, very questionable. And Israel has used dubious claims of the fact that the Suez was blocked by the Egyptians, and the fact that the Egyptian military was sort of, waving its finger at Israel from the Sinai, and Nasser was kind of saber rattling, that was significant justification to preempt a pending attack, imminent attack. That's the conversation around that. And so they did what they did, claimed that it was justified, and then they occupied and took over the Sinai, which has since been renegotiated back to Egypt for a peace agreement, including Gaza. They also have the Golan Heights and the West Bank, which have not changed and are occupied by Israeli troops to this day. And Israel claims it's its territory, but it's been divided up into 3 regions based on some accords where there's different power sharing. Some is Palestinian controlled, some is shared, some is exclusively Israeli, called the A, B, and C areas. That situation is very bad for the people that are occupied. Their lives are at the whim of the Israeli government and military. They can do anything, anytime, with anyone at their will. That's not a good situation to be under. So that can't be the solution, because people will never be happy under those circumstances. Now, let's talk about what the rhetoric is with Israel. We hear things like, we've offered the air. I'm going to say this with my eyes closed because I'm so tired, almost asleep from hearing it. We've offered the Arabs peace 5 times, very generous offers. All they do is say no every time. No. That is not true. If you go back and read the detailed provisions of each negotiation, you will find, much to the chagrin of your current belief system, that that's not the truth. That none of the deals offered were adequate for there to be peace, because none of them excluded complete Israeli control over the territory. Who wants to have autonomy when you don't have autonomy? That's not autonomy, that's control. And the Israelis put the security of their nation and their people over the potential for peace. That's just the way it's been. And then to claim the contrary, to paint the others as unwilling to be peaceful, then further justifies your brutality. That guarantees there'll never be peace, because when you brutalize people, they want to resist. And therefore you have the status quo. So what should happen? Here's what should happen. Israel should take its illegal settlements and get the hell out of the West Bank. Now, there's 700,000 people living there. That's not practical. But that's what should happen, because as they were building those settlements, everybody condemned them and said, you can't do this. This is land you illegally took in an offensive war that you claimed was defensive. And nobody's buying that explanation. You're delusional telling yourself it's justified, just like the US was delusional telling the world that invading Iraq was justified based on this claim of weapons of mass destruction and danger to the international community. Turned out to be bullshit. So did the allegations of Israel against its neighbors of an imminent attack. Turned out to be bullshit. But they took it anyway. Did they return it? Nope. They kept it. And at the same time, they justify keeping the other people under military occupation with no rights, even though they claim they own the territory. Can't have it both ways. If it's your territory and people live there, they get the right to citizenship. If it's not your territory, you're illegally occupying it, you got to get the hell out. You got to stop building in it. But they're not doing, they want it, they're doing it both ways. They're having what they believe is the best of both worlds for their aims. Oppressing another people brutally while building the land out slowly but surely to overtake it. That's been their plan. That's what's been happening. You can try to paint a narrative either way, but more and more things have been built, more and more people have moved in, and more land has been built on. Like that's, I think, indisputable. So what does that mean? Well, it means that it's impractical to have a territorial integrity for a Palestinian state in the West Bank. It's just impractical. It's so fragmented, so broken up. There's so much Israeli control. It's just not feasible. It's not likely. Plus, you can't ask 700, hey, Fauzi, stop asking me to be here. Get the hell out of here, please. You're trying to get something that just can't happen. It's like blood out of a stone. Now, since they won't be able to move those settlers out, and they're not going to, it leaves a very precarious situation because the only other option is, as I mentioned before, everyone gets citizenship. They're all incorporated into a single state, call it what you want, Israelstein or whatever you want to call it. And then everybody gets political rights equally under the law. Well, that means an Arab majority. Do you think that the Jewish ethno-state wants to have an Arab majority ruling it? Nope. So therefore, you have a real problem on your hands. You have a quagmire, a predicament where there's no easy answer. So from the Israeli point of view, the status quo, which has been a slow but steady disposition of land, unaliving of people, forcing them, they don't care. They're just getting more of what they want, and that's been the objective, it seems like, based on what they've been doing, not what they've been saying. Hold on, Quartzite. So because that's the case, it's going to be very difficult to find a simple and easy and politically viable solution. Now, as a part of the end of this, there are other states saying, we'll normalize our relations with you, Israel, but you have to work out something for the Palestinians to have some autonomy in some way, shape, or form, and leave it to them to figure it out and negotiate it. But it's got to be done in a way that's fair. It can't be one-sided, all Israel, controlling everything as it always wants to do, still brutalizing the people and not really giving them full autonomy. And Israel's response is, well, what do we do if these people attack us? Yeah, after we, quote, give them this. Well, first of all, you're not giving them something. You're removing yourself from an illegally occupied, you're removing yourself from stolen property. You're removing yourself from stolen property. You're not giving somebody anything. Okay? That's the first thing. You didn't give them back Gaza. You removed your illegal citizens and your settlers from territory you took by force. Okay? So that, just to make that clear, that would be the right solution, is to get the hell out, because you're interlopers, you're invaders, you're occupiers. But that's probably not practical. So I don't know exactly how they're going to try to work it out, but it seems like the Israelis continue to ignore those particular possible resolutions because they're like, well, F it, we want what we want. We'd like to have peace if we could get it, but not at the expense of our long-term ambitions. So F it. We have the U.S. backing us up at the UN. We're good to go. We can act with impunity. We can throw our weight around. No one's going to do shit about it. That's what's been happening. Now we have the northern half of Gaza completely flattened. We have horrible human beings like Jared Kushner, the son-in-law of Donald Trump, casually talking about just moving the people out and building beachfront property and everything's going to be A-OK. And then somebody asked him in the interview, well, what's going to happen? A lot of people think if people move out of Gaza and into the Sinai temporarily, that the Netanyahu government or others won't let them back in. He's like, oh, well, that's no big deal. Now, how can you cavalierly dismiss the dispossession and relocation of 2 million people so casually? It just shows you the callous indifference, the sheer arrogance of some of these people who are just these sociopathic Zionists who don't seem to care about anybody but themselves and their own money. So there is no simple answer, but there are answers. It's just the political will to do it is not there given the current dynamics. So the ICJ will do what it does. It will have findings in a year, 2 years, whatever it is. And that will be an indictment, more so, even more so, on what Israel's done so far and whatever the next steps may be, which will, of course, be further incorporated into their case. And we'll find out. And if Israel, as I believe it will, become such a rogue state where nobody wants to do business with them, nobody wants to support them other than the United States and maybe a few allies that have to be compliant, that eventually enough pressure internationally will be brought to bear to change the circumstances. That's my hope. But I'm not holding my breath on any of that. Somebody says, why aren't the other Arab nations doing anything? Well, first of all, it's not that the Arab nations, the nations that have a predominant Arab population, aren't doing anything. It's that the leaders in those countries have mixed allegiances based on how they've chosen to operate politically within the international community. So in many cases, what they should do morally versus what they do practically, given the power, the money, the other considerations, keep them from moving in and doing stuff. Now, you may say, well, why don't they just accept the people into their area, right? Why don't these Arab countries just take them? I've heard that a lot. Well, that's a fair question, but it's also a little bit of a biased question because during World War II and prior to World War II, there were Jewish refugees that were trying to find a place to settle. And guess what people said? Nobody wants them. So I don't like that language, them. It's sort of a disparaging term to use about others who you feel is just not worthy of your consideration. They're just disposable units that need to get out of your way. So let's call them who they are. They are Palestinian Arabs, predominantly, some Christians, mostly Muslims. And they have their own dignity and right to be where they are. Why do they not deserve land as much as you do? If you believe God gave you land for your people, why are you continuing to push people off of the place where they identify as their place to live? Why are they not worthy of it? Fair question. So how can you be so smug and cavalier that you anticipate or expect the Arab nations to just take them in as refugees because they happen to speak the same language? That's arrogant. And on top of that, the government's taking in refugees is a very costly and logistically painful process. It's not as easy to just snap your fingers and do it. There should be, what ideally would be, is some sort of military combined action to try to rectify this problem, but it's complicated. You got the United States with these carrier groups off the coast. If one of these other countries decided to attack, like Egypt, for example, which they won't because al-Sisi is co-opted by the West, but if he did, he'd be crushed. He knows that. The U.S. has all sorts of weapons and could bring other troops to bear. So it's not feasible militarily to take it on that way. It has to be a political solution anyway, long term. So the leverage they're going to try to do is they're going to use the results of this behavior by the Israelis to ostracize them, marginalize them, put pressure on them, economically isolate them as best as they can, and see what the U.S. does long term with its different administrations. That's where it is. Somebody here says nonsense. Onita Perkle says nonsense. What are you referring to? I wish people would say the thing you're saying about this is nonsense, but just using the word nonsense is meaningless. It's like calling me anti-Semitic. About what? You got to be specific there, Onita. And by the way, Onita, if you want to come up and talk, please do. If you're somebody who disagrees with the things I'm talking about, or if you have some other point of view you want to share with the audience, come on up. I'm happy to have you share your point of view. And also, if you're somebody who is pro-Israel, I would hope you'd come up because I'm just taking pro-Israel guests right now. Somebody here says you're such a hater. What am I hateful about here, Andrea? I just said that I do not believe that there's going to be a political settlement right now with respect to the long-term solution to this, and that it's going to take some time and it's going to take some pressure for one or the other power structures to give to change things. I think that's practical analysis. I wish I could say differently. But to say that that's hateful, why is that hateful? If you think me identifying Israel's crimes as hateful, most people who see this objectively, who have no dog in the hunt, no dog in the fight, look at Israel's behavior and just are totally flabbergasted. Because when you see images flowing through to your smartphone of women being shot in the head or kids being blown up and dismembered in buildings, even though what happened on the 7th was horrible and it was a terrible tragedy and an act of it was war crimes, everything, right? But people also compare in their mind, they have a perspective. They go, well, okay, 1,200 people or so on this side died, and then 35,000 on this side are dying, and most of them are kids and women. Now, the average person, when they see that, just as an objective human being, goes, that doesn't seem right. Especially when they're seeing it upfront and personal and all the crazy stuff. It's hard to emotionally cope with that in a way that's other than being critical of someone who's doing that. And we're seeing that in mass among the younger population because they have access to this stuff. So if you think that's hateful, I think it's just a normal human response, if that's what you're referring to. But if you want to come up and correct me and tell me how I can behave in a less hateful manner, I'm open to listening to you because I don't want to be hateful. So if you have a version you'd like to share with the audience, you want to share your point of view, I would very much like to hear it. I will be quiet. I will mute myself while you talk. I won't cut you off. But I would ask this, that everybody be nice to people in the comments with whom we may disagree, because being mean doesn't help the situation at all. Somebody here says it's time for nations to revolt against corruption and corrupted governments. Yeah, there's going to be a need for some of that. Kamak, Camille, are you pro-Israel or are you pro-Palestine? If you can write that in the comments. I'm going to wait for Kamak, Camille to answer that question. I'm only taking pro-Israeli guests right now. And while we're talking and waiting, I'm going to give them some of my coffee. Somebody says you're pro-Israel, Anita. Yeah, Anita, all you have to do is go to the little button in the middle of the screen just to the right and press it. It's a guest request button. And then come on up. I'd happily have you, Anita. So I can't invite you up on my own, though. You have to do a guest request. There's a little blue and red, like two persons, just right of center at the bottom. If you touch that, it'll allow you to ask to be a guest. So happy to have you up here. Yeah, listen, and by the way, I always talk about this, just for those of you who, first of all, there are probably people who don't even know who the hell this person is. So I'll just tell you quickly. My name is Chip Barnes. I'm an Army veteran, soon to be 57 years old. I live on the eastern side of the United States. I learned about the Israel-Palestine conflict when I was 21 years old. So it's been about 35 years or so. And so it's just been something of interest to me. I've studied, read a lot of books. Everyone has like a subject of interest. This has been one of mine. I served in the Army just before I left college. I learned about this, but when I went into the Army, I served in the first Persian Gulf War on the front lines in a tank unit. So I have seen combat. I know it's ugly, it's awful, and I can't even imagine what people are enduring right now in both of those, in both Israel and in Gaza and in the West Bank. It's bad. But anyway, so having said that, I do my best to analyze different things. I talk a lot about Russia, Ukraine. I've been talking a lot about Israel, Palestine since I've had this awareness for some time, and some people like what I have to say. They agree with my point of view. A lot don't. I try to be fair. I try to listen to others. But the way that I run my lives, for those of you who are new, is I keep it as respectful as possible. I listen to what people have to say. I give them airtime. I just don't want personal attacks, and I don't want to have cuss words or silliness. But as long as somebody has a legitimate point they want to advocate for, you're welcome to come up and share it. And we'll have a polite, civil conversation. We may not agree, but that's okay. And if you have resources you want to share with the audience that you think will help them better understand your point of view, by all means, bring them to the conversation. I can also do the same. I try to do things that are based on factual information, photographs, reports, written stuff, citations, videos, as best I can. But I do get some things wrong, and when I do, I correct myself. My views and my beliefs are not tied to my identity, so if something has to change, it changes, no big deal. So that's what it is. Anyway, so if you're somebody who favors Israel, let me see if I can get you. Yeah, Quartzsite, we're only doing pro-Israel guests right now, just for the time being. I'll do some pro-Palestinian guests shortly here if we need to. It says I need live access to go live. Lynn, how many followers do you have, Lynn? Let me see. You need to have at least 100 followers. Do me a favor, everybody. There's somebody named Lynn in the conference. She's very close to having 100 followers. Please follow Lynn so she can get over the 100 mark, and then she can come up as a guest. Please. Let me see if I can pin her comment. Because I think when you have 100 followers or more, you can come up. Maybe it's 200. Does anybody know the threshold for being able to be a guest? It's either 100 or 200 followers, and then to be a live host, you have to have 1,000. Somebody named Boyd Anderson 455 says, "Are you Christian, brother? Am I Christian? I don't affiliate with any particular religion. I tend to like the principles that are set forth by Christ and by Islam and by Judaism, the core operating principles of the religions. So I lean more towards the principles, but not the organized community of worship." Somebody says, Tony Montana says, "Am I pro-Zionist?" No, I'm not pro-Zionist. I criticize Zionism and the Zionist movement. Not the human beings, because I think most people are normal. And a lot of people who embrace Zionism do it solely for the purpose of believing in the establishment of a Jewish homeland. And I understand that. And I have no reason to dispute the desire for that by anybody. I can't condemn anybody for that. The point I bring up about Zionism is, unfortunately, it is more than just that. And the belief system projects itself further than just that. And it also looks away from the harm caused by implementing the very thing that it stands for. And that's why I take issue with it. Not because I don't want Jewish people to be safe from harm or have a place to be where they can, enjoy the community and culture among each other and be safe from persecution. I'm 100% behind that. So somebody says, "I don't agree with this point." I'm not sure which point you're talking about. So Quartzite, we're only doing, just to let you know, I'm going to just wait for a guest to come up who's pro-Israel. So if you're somebody, by the way, if you can, I think it was Lynn, if you can follow Lynn. Tropical Life Avocado, you can come on up if you want to. Some people are having an interaction with you in the chat. No, somebody says, "I don't believe Israel." Let me clarify Tropical Life. So he says, "So you don't believe Israel has a right to exist?" Here's what I would say. This is the best way I can put it. And this is just trying to be, as if you put a tap up to my head and had Neuralink, this is what would come out. So I have mixed feelings about it. And it's not because I don't want to have one group have the benefits of what's occurred. I'm all for that. The challenge that comes into my thinking, and as I've read and studied the history and tried to figure it all out, is why was it that other families and people had to suffer as a result of the establishment of this particular ethno-state? And is the establishment of an ethno-state in a region where there's a large mix of different ethnicities and religions the smartest move? Even if people do believe that there's some historical connection to the land that's based on their particular ethnicity or religion or both. That is why I look at it in that different way. So I think that's fair to acknowledge. Even if you're someone who's pro-Israel, it's fair to acknowledge that some families, villages, people were harmed, displaced, moved off. Not that it hasn't happened to others, and not that it hasn't happened to Jewish people before. Obviously it has, but the fact that it has happened to Jewish people before does not make up for the fact that people were harmed. And two rights don't make a wrong. Just because Jewish people were persecuted elsewhere during the millennia doesn't somehow justify them then persecuting another to its benefit.
Hey, Chip.
Hello there. Are you pro-Israel or pro-Palestine?
I'm kind of on the fence, to be honest with you.
Okay. What's on your mind? What would you like to talk about?
No, I met you before. I fly all around the world. I go to the Middle East all the time. Never mind other places. I can tell you that this is my opinion. This has been a war, if you will. I hope I don't get violated for saying that, for such a long time. And there are so many victims on both sides. And it is literally a humanitarian crisis. One side thinks they're right, the other side thinks they're right. And we're kind of thrown in the middle and to pick, if you will, what we believe in or what side is right. And I think that's unfair because if you don't travel and you don't live there or you don't immerse yourself in that culture, you don't get it. It's so easy as an American to sit here in our lazy boys and to make judgments and spit venom at people, but you have to be there. You have to immerse yourself, and I just think that is a big talking point that people really miss.
Do
Sorry,
you,
Chip.
do you believe if someone like myself were to go and stay in Israel for a period of time and then stay in Gaza for a period of time and then stay in the West Bank for a period of time, that my assessment of the conflict would shift dramatically?
I don't know. It depends on your values and your morals, I guess, and your beliefs. I mean, there are places like if you go to I don't even go to Israel. I've never been because if I go to Israel, there are places that there are countries that I can't actually go into that I need to go into. You know, I don't know if you know that, but yeah, if you have Israel stamped on your passport, you are not allowed in some countries. So
Interesting.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Look it up. I just, I don't know. I'm on the fence. I feel bad for both sides. I see the validity on both sides, but when you travel to different places and you see different cultures and you hear their stories and you see their people, it kind of breaks you down a little bit and makes you rethink what you actually think. Does that make any sense, or am I just babbling?
Well, I mean, obviously, if you're someone who stands in the middle, I can understand your point of view. I think some agree with you on that. The reason why I don't agree and the way I see it is because of analyzing the behavior by both sides of this issue over a long period of time and sort of what happened to whom, by whom, when, where, and how.
Right,
And I know nothing's perfect, and both sides have done things obviously that are objectionable, and that's a fair thing to point out. The question is, at what pace, at what quantity, in what manner, and what are the power dynamics over time, and who's been harmed much more frequently than the other potentially, and does that make a difference or not? And if, where have things been equitably adjudicated or not? And those are sort of the standards and the principles that I use to try to evaluate anything. And in this
right.
case, the reason I come down to where I come down to is because other than what I was told growing up, which was not much, but versus what I then learned, there was such a vast distance between those two that I figured, and I kind of still believe, that it's purposeful, that most people are not made aware of many of the characteristics and traits of this conflict, that if they did know about it, they would see it much differently. And
Right.
out of the blue in 1989, just happened to hear it by virtue of one of my classmates giving a presentation on the first Intifada from 1987. And that just completely changed my view on this conflict. I didn't know what I didn't know about all of it. And then I did know, I was like, well, wait a second, this is bizarre. This was never part of the puzzle. And so
Right.
when we hear part A of a story and then you later hear part B, A makes a lot more sense than B when you don't have B.
In Love and Light, I just if you'd give me the minute to respond to his comment, it says it's a little broken.
Can you tell us what the comment was so we understand?
Yeah, absolutely. It says, why is that? Do you think flying the world? It's because I'm privileged. I work for DoD, DOS, and ICE, and I think that Chip knows this. We've talked about it before. And so I get to fly to different places all around the world, and I get to immerse myself in different countries and different cultures, no matter the creed, the religion, nothing, the race, anything. And when you get to do that, and again, I'm privileged. When you get to do that, you kind of you well, I think you should. It's my truth, anyways. How's that? That I have taken the position that I kind of feel bad for everyone. I know that's kind of a cop out, but I really do because you don't get to see it. You sit here, people do sit here, they watch CNN, they watch Fox, and they're sitting in their lazy boy and they hear the news, and yeah, it's horrible. It's absolutely horrible. But when you actually get there and you see the people and you talk to these people that are good people, they're good people, then you may or may not change your mind on your beliefs. So that's why I say I'm on the fence because I don't want to take a side. I but I and I get both sides. I really do. Even though I shouldn't, because it's not my truth, it's their truth. And
Are you open to some well-intended feedback that's not meant to come from a
absolutely,
place of?
absolutely, Chip.
Okay,
You
so
know I
let me,
you're
so
so
just
intelligent.
I may be alone in this assessment, and I don't mean this to be a criticism of you. I just want to share a perception that I have And if you find it's incorrect, then certainly correct me. But when you say that people in the public have a certain view because they're sitting in their lazy boy at home watching CNN, it presumes that everybody here is only obtaining their information from that one source and that they're lazy in the work they do to understand it. So that comes across to people like you're some enlightened human being that because you've traveled, you have some insights that others will never have or something to that extent. So it's in fairness, it's fair to ask people what they know, how they came to know it, instead of assuming they don't because you've traveled.
You're correct, and I accept what you just said, and I will take that into consideration. I do consider myself. Like I said, it's my truth. It's not your truth. I just feel like that sometimes people get up on TT lives and they are just like volatile and rude and mean, and they spit venom at things that they really don't know anything about. When you know I don't know, Chip. I'm just like I'm on the fence. I'm
Well,
sorry.
you're entitled to your views, like everybody's entitled to their take. I mean,
Right.
let me ask you an honest question, and I ask these of everybody, so I'm not soloing you out. So obviously, I've shared with you some of my journey of what I've encountered and how I've sort of shaped my views, and the books that I've read, and the podcasts I've watched, and the lectures I've been to, and the people I've spoken to, and all the other things I've done in terms of trying to figure stuff out. And you can never know it all, but you can have a path of having tried to learn a lot, and sometimes you catch a lot of that. And I think that's kind of where my journey's taken me. But not everybody has the same conclusion after bumping into the same things as I have, and that's okay. But have you read any books by people like Norman Finkelstein or Ilyan Pape or other authors like that who are scholars of the conflict?
I have not.
Okay. Have you watched any documentaries like Gaza Fights for Freedom or Tantura or Al Nakba or The Life in Occupied Palestine or anything like that?
I have watched a few documentaries. I haven't watched them fully. I'll just get on Netflix or Max and or Prime and I watch it for a little bit and then it just stresses me out. But
There's a movie
Chip,
on Netflix. You mentioned Netflix. There's one called Farah. Have you heard of that one?
no, I'm going to actually look it up right now.
It's no, there's a term called that's called the catastrophe. In Arabic, it's called Nakba. But that's the term generally that people use whose families were dispossessed of their land as a part of the creation of the state of Israel. It was a pretty traumatic event where about 700 and some, maybe close to 800,000 people ended up having to move. Some died, some were forced to flee because of adjacent villages being massacred.
Right.
It was a very tumultuous event for a lot of people who were Arab at the time, and they refer to themselves as Palestinian, who feel that they have the right to return based on what had happened. So it's called the catastrophe. Collectively refers to those series of events involving that time frame.
What's it
So
called? I'm on Netflix right now.
on Netflix, it's a fictional story of what a young woman went through as a part of that process called Farah. I think it's spelled Farah or Fahra or something like that.
Hold on.
So that's a perspective on a more human level of what someone went through as a young person during that time. So, but some of the more technical stuff, which I've read, of course, and I wouldn't speak from it if I hadn't. A great one that's easy to watch on YouTube. It's free. It's quick to watch. Is called Life in Occupied Palestine. And I think in my opinion, that documentary by a young Jewish woman who visited the occupied territories for 5 months when she was younger and because friends were telling her things that were happening there that she did not believe, and she's like, you guys are brainwashed, you've been propagandized, you're crazy, this would never happen, this is Israel. And so she went, and then what she found out, like I found out when I was in 1989 when I was 21, I was like, holy smokes, well, how did I not know this? And so her documentary covers the specifics of what people endure under Israeli occupation in those territories on a
Right.
regular basis. So it's called Life in Occupied Palestine. You can watch it for free. It's about 40 minutes. And I'm going to show it at one point on my lives. I'm just going to schedule it. I'll do an announcement video and I'm just going to show it. Anybody who hasn't seen that, I personally don't think they should be allowed to weigh in on the conflict. But
I'm getting accosted, literally. I want to leave, but I still want to talk to you, Chip, because you're
well, hold
so.
on. Let me make an announcement. So, anybody in the comments who's listen, everybody, has there been a time in your life when at one point you had not encountered something and later you did and your views were informed accordingly? And if that's ever happened to you, this particular guest may be in that same spot that you were, And if somebody is open-minded as she seems to be, let's give her a chance to encounter it before we, criticize her or make disparaging statements, because her views are where they are for a reason, because it's what her journey has taken her through at this point. Let's be
Right.
fair.
And I'm uneducated when it comes to this. And I will solely admit that I guess I haven't learned enough about both sides. And I just take human beings as human beings and their stories at face value when I talk to them and I hear their stories. So, but I guess maybe that makes me uneducated. And that's why I came up on your live chat, because I know that you are so educated and you have so many followers that adore you and you speak truth, and that's why I'm here. So please don't accost me, because I'm a really good person and I don't deserve the hateful comments.
I mean,
I'm
I'd
just
love to
gonna
stay
keep
directly in
going.
con- are you open to staying directly in contact? Because there are some
Yeah.
other things. Like there's a great documentary called Israelism, which just was released recently. It's one. There's one called The Occupation of the American Mind, which covers the relationships of pro-Israeli influence groups in the United States and the media, stuff like that. There's another one that I like to watch. There's a whole bunch of different ones we can talk about, but there are many great books. One's called The Israel Lobby by John Mearsheimer, which is just an incredible laying out of how Israel has orchestrated its campaigns to influence American policy over the decades. Obviously, some of this stuff's controversial. There are books that are pro-Israel by authors like Benny Morris
Right.
and Alan Dershowitz, all of which I've read and try to
Send them
get.
to me,
Yeah.
a DM me. I would be more than happy to look at them and in my free time read them. I'd love to do that. Like I said, I adore your lives. I think you are so intelligent. You have a great following, and I trust you. How's that?
No, that's fair. So if you want to contact me, my email, it's in my bio, but it's just chipbarnesonline at Gmail. So we can keep a loose connection and I can give you a bit here and there and you can consume it at your ability and we can go from there.
Okay, thank you, Chip. I'm gonna get off the live so someone else can jump in. I love everybody. Please don't think I'm a monster because I said that I was on the fence. I just
Okay.
am uneducated enough, and I'm gonna learn. And I hope that I will make a decision that is right for me and my morals and my values. And I love
Cool.
everybody, like I said, Chip. So
Awesome.
take care, everybody. Love you all.
Thanks for
Bye.
being here. Really
All right.
appreciate you being here.
Bye,
See,
sweetie.
now, this should be everybody's goal, in my opinion, and that is, there are people that aren't going to be willing to entertain anything. They're going to hold on to their views. They want to hear, confirmation bias, and then we have other people that are sort of, not really clear exactly, and they're open. And in that case, once you understand that somebody, that is a golden ticket to share some information with somebody. And now they can choose to ignore it if they want. That's their prerogative. Or they may entertain it. And the opportunity to influence somebody, not in a way to try to convince them of stuff like indoctrinate them, but just give them a chance to expose themselves to other stuff. And if they embrace it, they do. If they don't, they don't. But that's the kind of person that I like to talk to, because that's how people become aware. Just like I was made aware, that's how maybe somebody like her might be made aware. So when you meet somebody like that, rather than beating them up, butter them up, and accept the fact that they are where they are. It's not their fault. They know what they know because of what they've bumped into. She may know a lot more about stuff because of her travels that we won't hope to know. And that's probably true. And there's probably a lot we can learn from somebody like her. She may have been to places like Bali. I don't know anything about Bali, and she might. So I'd love to learn. Anyway, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but anyway, so here's Onita. Great, Onita's going to come up. Welcome, Onita. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Give me a second. I'm just moving this from my phone.
Okay,
Um, so
I'm going to eat a corn chip while she's waiting to come up. Corn chips and avocado, one of my favorite.
not a bad choice. So some of the concerns I had, I didn't get to hear a lot of what the previous person was saying because I was having some issues connecting. I got this weird error when I
Hmm.
went to connect with you. It said that I was in another live and I was unable to connect.
Wow, it's
I
weird.
don't know what that was. So in other words, I had to restart my phone.
Okay.
Um, my issue is, but one of the things that I heard was, first of all, when you go to Israel, they don't stamp your passport. It's not a thing. So, as a matter of fact, most countries nowadays don't stamp your passport
Okay.
when you travel. Second of all, I think a lot of what concerns me in some of the language that you use is when you, and I'm sure you've been through this a countless amount of times with people that are pro-Israel, like myself.
Okay.
Um, when you say the word Zionist, it is an offensive word to someone as a Jewish person because
Okay.
most of the time it is wielded as a slur. And that is the issue. And it's very hard for people to understand that.
In your mind, can you tell the audience from your point of view, what do you believe the word Zionism is, and how do people misinterpret it so that it's used in a disparaging way?
Okay, so what I believe Zionism is self-determination
Okay.
for Jewish people. That is what I believe. I don't, and I know one of the key things you like to go to is, Herzl and Theodore Herzl and his political ideology and this, that, and the other. That, if I go back 2,000 years in my Torah, Zion is Jerusalem. That is what it's referred to in our Torah. It is mentioned many, many, many times. When we conclude a Seder, it's next year in Jerusalem. When we could, there are so many things intertwined with our religion that, and in the Torah, that have the word Zionism, Zion in it. It is so for the last 5 months to have people wield, well, I don't hate Jews, I just hate Zionists. Okay, well, where do I fit in that? Because I'm a Jewish person, and yet the scripture and the word that I read has mentioned Zion many, many, many times in the Torah. So it's, and then when it's wielded, you might say, well, I don't use it as a slur, and it's Zionism isn't anti-Semitism. When someone is dehumanizing you and persecuting you for being a Zionist, that in itself is the very definition of anti-Semitism. There's no, the word anti-Semitism was invented by a German guy. I mean, that's why it's one word, it's not hyphenated. It's, and we can get into the semantics of Semitism or Semite, but
Is it okay if I jump in and ask you a question?
sure.
Okay, so I'm trying to make the connection. There was a little bit of a leap there that you did. I want to just clarify how you went to that place that you went. So you said that when you feel, I believe this, I'm paraphrasing, you said, when you feel that when somebody uses the term in what you perceive to be a disparaging way, that is dehumanizing you. So I guess the fair question to ask would be, do you believe, honestly, that most people who refer to being against Zionism, I never say the word hate, I use the word opposing. And the reason why I oppose Zionism and people who are advocates for Zionism is not because I oppose a safe homeland for Jewish people, but in terms of reading into people's motives, I think that's a place where I try to be careful. You may have your own feelings, but do you believe that every person who is opposing Zionism is using it as a code word to say they are hateful towards Jewish people in general?
In my experience, yes, Chip.
Okay.
In my personal experience, yes, Chip. And
Okay.
and when someone says to me boldly, if you support the latter, you
Hello,
are a
hello, Chip.
disgusting
Hello,
human.
everybody.
It is a slur. So how am I supposed to decipher from one person to the next whether they're using it in context as a slur or not?
Well, in other words, there's a lot of ways to say something. So let me give you one example. Okay, so let's say said, there were a lot of people there in 1922. There was about 2% of Jews in Palestine. Okay, that's one way of saying something. Or I could say there were a bunch of Jews in Palestine, 2% of which clogged up the place, and so much different references on the same word, right?
Absolutely.
Because of the emphasis that was placed on it. It was sounded more disparaging. The first one was more descriptive. The second one was more pejorative, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so in light of that, some people, in terms of their conversation, are not as adept at using less or more linguistic skills in their discussions. Now, it doesn't mean they're stupid. It just means that they may not be sensitive to the referencing of the term in a way that might elicit the response that you're referring to. So when someone like myself says, I'm against Zionism or I'm against Zionists, it's not that I'm against the safety and security of the Jewish people. I think that perception, if it's happening that way, I don't want it to come across that way. What I'm trying to refer to is, you mentioned your religion and how the return to Zion is a part of your belief system. Fair enough. But when people who formulated the movement, that was not the focus that they wrote in terms of their perception and their aims
No,
for the
I've
movement.
read Herzl. Trust me, I'm pretty well versed in the political ideology of
Okay.
Herzl. I actually just made my kids listen to it, just so that they're informed enough to talk about these sorts of things in
Good.
conversations. Because, unfortunately, right, in the time that we live in, these are conversations that we are openly having. And so, and that being said, well, I appreciate you, defining whether one is pejorative and one is not. I think if I were to generalize a lot of what I see on this app, I, and it's likely my algorithm, I will give that variable to it. I will say that a lot of times when it is thrown around, it is thrown around as a slur. And when someone says, but it's not, but anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism aren't the same. Okay, if you're comparing it as a political ideology, fair point. But when you're using it to persecute somebody or judge them as their character or dehumanize them for believing in said religion or teachings, what have you, that's the problem. And that's what
Okay.
I see a lot on this app. And I think it's really important to,
Yeah,
to
I agree with
talk
you.
about that.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think that differentiation is one that I try to make as much as humanly possible. I've done specific videos just about what you just talked about. I think that's more than fair to point out. Listen, people have told me that, hey, Chip, most people who are Jewish identify as being a Zionist, and therefore criticism of Zionism
Yeah,
feels
they
anti-Semitic. And
do.
I can understand that. I have noticed a pattern, and I don't say this to be mean-spirited about it, but it's just an observation that I'll make, and that is, and I saw this with Rabbi Barclay. If you saw the interview with Rabbi Barclay and Candace Owens recently, and I've also seen Rabbi Shmuley in his interactions with folks and others, there is an observation, and this is not done to disparage anyone. It just is, there is a very strong level of sensitivity to the use of language in any way that can be perceived as critical, in some ways that makes it very difficult to even address various subjects, which should, under normal circumstances, be perfectly legitimate to talk about or say in certain ways. But others are deemed as so sensitive and so, I don't know, upsetting, that it makes it difficult for anyone to even have what would be considered an objective, non mean spirited, non hate driven conversation because others take offense to it.
I completely agree with that sentiment, and I think unfortunately it's that variable for people like myself who consider themselves, a, a practicing Jewish person, that um, there's a lot of, we're on the defense a lot, and so maybe that doesn't always come across as a productive conversation and means to have communication about this very, very um, polarizing subject. And I didn't see the two rabbis that you refer to, but I can tell you that Shmuley, I mean, I think he's a bit of a hothead, and there's a lot of there's and as a Zionist, there's a lot of stuff that I don't agree with the government of Netanyahu and his Knesset. I don't agree with everything. But what I will say is I believe to my right to self-determination. I believe for me to go out and freely, um, you know, practice my religion or send my daughter or son to a youth group and make sure that their safety is ensured, which these things have all become questionable things that I have never had to consider. Things like telling my 17-year-old, hey, you might not want to wear that sweatshirt that's written in Hebrew out in public because I don't want you to get hate crimed. Because that's where we are today, Chip.
Well, it's okay if we examine some of what might precipitate or be the origins of some of the discomfort, or what causes others to feel maybe in a way that creates that discomfort. Is that fair to talk about?
I would say so.
So one of the other observations I've made about this, and this is not, again, not to be critical of you, this is other people that I've noticed, and it's sort of a common theme that I feel that's interwoven among some of the points of view. So My take is, after thinking about the issue for a long time and hearing other people talk about it and what motivates them, it's different than what is perceived by others. Let me try to elaborate. So I can understand if I was somebody from a Jewish family and I'm going to go outside and just live my life and I feel uncomfortable because of potential animus towards me for something I didn't do other than be myself. I completely think that's a legitimate concern, and it's one that I would not enjoy being subject to, nor anybody. So that is what it is. I think where people sometimes struggle with some of that perception is for the following reason. I've seen it in the comments. The perception is among people that if the movement for a Jewish homeland was completely benign, insofar as it was a land without a people for a people without a land, and people just moved into a region and did what they did, and there was just no other impact. I think that would be something that is not worthy of being criticized or being upset about, because then it would be just about Jewish people. But I think most people come at it from a pretty good faith position. The reason why they're upset, and this is not everybody obviously, but people who have been directly affected by this, is because as the foundation of the state of Israel, there was a lot of displacement and a lot of disruption to the territory that knowingly was going to happen. Those who were doing this, who were orchestrating this, knew it was going to be problematic at best. If you look back at the diary of people like David Ben Gurion, the first prime minister, he directly said things like, "We are taking their land. They are going to want to resist." Things like this, just normal behavior. So what happens is when people are dispossessed, obviously, directly, when people die among their groups, their villages get razed, they have to flee, as Jews have had to do over the years. It's upsetting, and I think that's what drives the core feeling towards the Zionist movement. In other words, the political settler part of it, not the Jewish part of it. But it comes out that way when people criticize the political side, as you said earlier. So on top of that, well, I think what the reason people are really angry, and this is where most of my, my disagreement with Israeli policy and the Israeli, the way things have unfolded, is especially after 1967, because it was very tough for people to endure the disruptions that took place in 1947, and people were made refugees, and there were a lot of losers. Listen, I'm glad that there was a homeland for Jewish people. I think that's a great aspiration, to be safe from persecution. And if you have the religious connection, I guess I don't know that for sure, but that's what people appear to believe. But my point on that is this: it didn't benefit everybody. Some people got harmed by it greatly. So therefore, they have a right to be upset. When you're harmed, you have a right to not it be good to go with that. I have to walk the dog again, damn it. But anyways, I can still talk. I just have to go outside. But she's kind of screaming at me. But the point I'm trying to make is, I think people's anger is
You can
not
have
coming
the
up.
right to be upset and
Hold on,
advocate.
hold on a second. Let me finish the thought. And I think it'll make sense once I finish the thought. I just didn't convey it very well yet. So my belief is that this is where I think it's misperceived. I think a lot of people who are sensitive to this think that when people are critical of the things that affected their families and their people and their sense of justice, that their anger is not towards the people or the religion or the faith or the ethnicity. As one person said in the Muslim community, he said, "I don't care if my cousin had done this to me, who's Arab and Muslim, I would be upset that this had been done to me by this particular person." So the anger isn't the anger and frustration, and sometimes hatefully so, is put towards people because they are representative to them of the anger they feel towards the injustice that their people suffered, such that they criticize what they believe is the political settler ideology portion of the movement, which ended up creating some of these harms as they perceive them. So when they use the term, they're leaning towards that aspect of what had happened, not the individual Jewish people or hate towards Jews in general.
So I have a question for you.
Yeah,
When was Palestine a sovereign nation?
it wasn't.
Okay, you're right, it wasn't. So uh,
Yeah,
to use the words colonialism and settler, I find a hard time with that. I mean, I am also just a Jew of color. So I will also tell you that, we all aren't white. I am a Mexican. So if I really wanted to drill down in my DNA, I'm
okay.
really 46% indigenous and 30 something percent Spanish, which we can definitely talk about colonialism there, but the issue is that they weren't sovereign. And so I understand what you're saying. You're saying, well, people are upset because this was a very violent, what their land was taken from them, but the they were Jordan before 1948. They were British Palestine, and part of that was Jordan, and part of it was Egypt. So even we can go back 2,000 years if you want to, and talk about all the Crusades and the Assyrians and the Romans and the Byzantines and everything else. We can go back, and one can say, well, you're just talking about theology and a book. No, this is archaeological evidence that exists. I mean, I've gone back, especially in this time and age. I've gone back and I've read history. I've read the DNA lineage, how Arabs in that region and how the remaining Jews in that region for a period of time, they share the same DNA. Um, and the reality is that land was colonized for many, many years over different empires and crusades and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But yet the Jewish people and have archaeological evidence that takes them back 3,000 years. How do you explain that?
Well, I think it's also fair to point out, I think most historical analysis of this begins with who was riding in the territory during the formulation of the Balfour Declaration, the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire, and of course the migration patterns that occurred post World War I. So again, what I like to say, as other scholars say, that if we're going to go back in time, we could theoretically pick 4,000 years, 5,000 years, 1,200 years. I mean, it's really hard to cherry pick a particular time in history and try to make.
Well, it doesn't go back that far. We're talking about when the land moved from the 12 empire, from the 12 tribes onto the Romans, and when the Second Temple was destroyed by the Romans. We can. It doesn't go back 12,000 years or 5,000 years.
Well, let's.
If you
I
really
don't.
want
That's
to talk about
the
the
path.
archaeological evidence, it goes by
The path that
3,000 years ago.
the path that I don't want to veer down is that one, because that's a very lengthy conversation. But we were talking about the sentiment, which I think is legitimate from the side that you described. What I'm trying to share with you is I do not think the motivation for the way people analyze it and feel basically hurt by what had happened is not based on the hatred for the ethnicity or religion. It's based on the things that happened that harmed their parents and grandparents. Just like people who survived the Holocaust or whose parents didn't, God forbid, feel angry about that injustice, although that was at a broader scale,
Well,
obviously.
just as the indigenous people in our land, in America today, feel injustices for what we have
Yeah,
done to
exactly.
the
But
people of this
here,
land,
yeah,
but they're not acting out in this way, Chip, and that's the difference.
well,
That's the difference.
there's a
You
big
don't
difference.
have Native Americans. I have a caregiver that takes care of my mom who's Navajo. Like, you don't have Native Americans
Is
like
the
at
is the
such a
United
polarizing
is the
view.
United States military actively shooting and killing Native Americans?
Absolutely not. But we did.
Exactly.
But you
That's the
can't. You
point.
can't. But you can't change the
That's the
fact
point.
that the United States government did some really
Exactly.
systemic things wrong to the
Of
indigenous
course.
people. And
That's the
so,
point. That's the point of all this. That's the
but
point of all this.
yeah, but they're not. But the point is, you're trying to say that that's why they're acting this way. No, you don't act out this way, and you don't commit atrocities, and you don't keep unaliving individuals and creating such a polarizing place where where people don't feel safe, even in their own communities, in their own homes.
Well,
You can certainly be angry and advocate for yourself and speak out for yourself, but not in such a polarizing, violent way. I mean, there are
I just
many.
want to make sure. I want to be consistent here. So you're telling me that you condemn the people that did the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto, that they should have sat back and accepted their fate?
Exactly.
That I condemn what?
Exactly what you're
You
saying.
condemn the Jewish people that rose up against the Germans in the Warsaw Ghetto and tried to fight back against their plight. Is that something they should not have done?
You're comparing two things here. You're asking me to compare that, an uprising, to a, a group that went into another land, sovereign land, with its own government and committed atrocities on 1,200 people. It's not the same thing.
Were Germans oppressing Jews during the 1940s?
Everybody has been oppressing Jews. For
Okay, well,
3,000 years, they have oppressed Jews.
hold on. Let's just focus on that question. So, were the
No,
Germans
no, I'm
oppressing
not
Jews?
going to focus on the question because you're not addressing the issue. You're
Oh,
trying to justify.
I'm trying to
You're
clarify.
trying to
Hold on.
justify
Let me go with the arguments.
atrocities,
Hold on,
and
hold on. let me do this. I just want to, it wasn't to try to make you answer a question. It's try to create a comparison of sentiment, okay? Yes, the Germans were ruthlessly oppressing Jews and trying to exterminate them and deport them, but that was horrible. Under oppression in general, I know the circumstances were vastly different, so I'm not trying to compare the circumstances. I'm trying to create a perception of how people behave under an awfully repressive situation and how they can respond to it. So if we're going to condemn one group for responding to what they perceive to be oppressive, never ending circumstances, and they do something that you find and most people find vile, which I agree, and other people in the same circumstance lash out as well in what they could do with what they had. I look at those as similar in terms of sentiment, of not wanting to be oppressed and wanting to be free of oppression. So I think in that regard, you can compare the situations, although they were drastically different in terms of the actual nature of the oppression.
I think it's interesting that you're using that context because you're using the narrative and context that the Israeli government is oppressing
It is.
The Palestinians. But I got to
Absolutely.
ask you, who's running the West Bank and who's running Gaza? Who's running that? Who's the
Well,
sovereign government? No, answer the question. Who is
hold
the
on.
sovereign
I'll
government in
tell you
those three areas?
I'll tell you, you know what the answer. The Palestinian Authority is in charge in the West Bank, and Hamas is
Okay.
in charge in the Gaza
And,
Strip.
and the H group holds 70 to 80 seats in the PLO. Now let's go to Gaza.
I just told you it's solely run by Hamas.
Okay, so those are that is the government that is running those. Now, does that mean that that I don't wake up every day and go, this shit has got to stop? Sorry. I am tired of seeing people harmed. I'm tired of seeing Palestinians harmed. I'm tired of seeing the what the effect of that is happening on that basis. But at the same time, you've got a governing body that attacked another sovereign nation. There was a ceasefire before October 7th.
There's a very interesting observation. I don't know if you're driving or if you're at home or something like that, but if you go to Google and you type into the Google search box, is a blockade an act of war? And by all standards internationally, there is a military, naval, air, and land blockade of Gaza by the Israeli government. And so, therefore, according to that, there was no peaceful circumstance. There may have been a temporary ceasefire.
That according to the UN, is that what you're using?
No, that's called the definition of the word blockade, according to
Okay.
all accepted principles under
Well, I
the.
know the UN usually has, there's general definitions and then the UN will have their own definition. I mean, have you ever looked up the word indigenous according to the UN and
Well, in other words,
the
we're talking about the circumstances under which the attack occurred. So the point is, you said your claim was you said that it was peace on October 7th, right? That's what you said, right?
I didn't say there was peace.
Okay.
I said there was a ceasefire.
Yeah, but that's an
Those are
ongoing form of war. So in other words,
Yeah, but those are two different things. As peace, if you define it, and ceasefire are not the same.
do you know what
They
happened on October 2nd and 3rd?
I know that there were a lot of things happening
Israel
politically.
killed 4 Palestinians with drone attacks. That's not a ceasefire.
But what about the unaliving of people coming in and harming like Israelis? What are we going to
You're
talk about that? Or
talking about the
are we
7th?
just going to talk about? Are we not going to
No,
talk
no,
about?
no. You said a second ago. I'm just clarifying for what you said. You said there was a ceasefire on October 6th. That's
There
what you
was
said.
a
There,
ceasefire
there
on
was a
October.
ceasefire that was broken by Israel 3 days earlier.
Please send me the resource because I can't speak to something that you just like I don't
Which,
know.
by the way, is a constant practice of the Israelis when they claim that the H group has created a situation. Israel will kill some people and fire back. They
You've
blame
never
Hamas.
been to Israel, okay? B, you are speaking on you are speaking like you're speaking on things that you really are only looking at from one side.
Have you been to the
And
moon before, Anita?
that's not even the same thing. Me
No,
going to
but I mean,
Israel,
is it
going there.
possible to
What's
understand
your
something
point?
without?
What's your point?
Is it possible to understand something without traveling there?
Well, you're trying to tell me that the way that the H group attacks is a justified form
I didn't
of.
say that. I didn't say that.
I think
Those
that's
words,
the context you were saying.
those words never came out of my mouth.
But you were saying that it was justified, and that there are a group of people that are reacting in this way.
What I would
Because
to differentiate, just be
you
clear. No,
want,
no, you made a statement that I think was very, it's very encompassing. So I want to make sure I differentiate for you. So what I said was, under the circumstances of being militarily blockaded, under international law and every other standard of conflict, the one who's being blockaded and contained by a military force has every right to try to fight back against that occupying force or the blockading force. Now, do I agree with the tactics that were employed against civilians? Absolutely not. Those are definitive war crimes, should be punished as such, and those people should be tried and punished accordingly, or if they survive. So, and similarly, in the same vein, for the deaths that have occurred inside of Gaza from those who have used indiscriminate force, indiscriminate bombing, using
you do
tactics of
understand why
self-defense.
there's a blockade, though. You
I
understand
do,
that, right? Because
I understand for
years
Israel's.
and years and
I get
years
it.
of
I get it. I get it.
people coming in
I
and
get it.
bombing bus
I
stations and harming
hold on,
civilians.
Onita.
For
Rather than claiming that I don't understand why don't you ask me?
well, I mean, I don't know that you do because I feel like I'm having
But
to
how do you find
present
you don't make
a question.
assumptions? I've never
It's a
once said to you,
Chip,
Anita, I've
Chip,
never once
Chip.
said to you,
If
hold
you
on,
want to have a
hold on, hold on. I've never once said to you, you don't understand this because I'm asking you questions. So do the same for me, okay? What I was trying to say to you, it's for Israel's security. You didn't give me a chance to answer. You just went on and on. So I understand that. That's Israel's justification for what it chooses to do. I'm not saying that's an invalid justification. What I'm saying is that it results in a military blockade, which is an ongoing act of war, regardless of justification. That's what the law of war talks about. We have a Geneva Convention, we have standards, and this is what the world adheres to. And according to the world, Israel is illegally occupying the West Bank and it maintains a crushing military blockade on Gaza. That's just fact. Sorry about that. So let's ask each other questions rather than assuming what
No,
somebody.
I'm feel free because I feel like every time, like I'm trying to speak with you, and I feel like you're just talking over me. So,
No,
like,
no.
you just gave a definition, and you told me the world. Well, I think that's a generalization, and if you want to speak, if you want to have a productive conversation, I think it's really important to stay away from generalizations. I think
What was
generalization,
generalized? What was too generalized? I just
the
want to make sure.
whole world, that is a generalization.
Well, every other nation on earth has acknowledged
The
that the
UN.
occupation.
How about you just correct the sentence and say the UN
It's not the UN.
believes that it says.
It's every
Is
other
that's
nation
the
on
whole
earth.
question? That's
You're asking me to clarify. I'm clarifying for you. It's not just the memberships in the UN. Every nation on earth except for Israel believes that that
that's
territory is
a
illegally occupied.
generalization, Chip. Every nation on earth is a generalization. Now, if you want to,
Every statement publicly made, according to every nation state on the earth, has said that the occupation of Palestine by Israel is illegal under international law. That is just a fact.
under these states and the countries that you're referring from words that come from documented UN either white papers or what has been said in assembly.
They're
That is what
form,
you're referring to. So if you're going
those
to
sentiments
say
are
that,
those
say it.
sentiments are formally incorporated into UN Resolution 242 through the
Okay,
UN.
exactly. So you're saying the UN. So when you say the whole world or the
Every
or
nation state,
every
I said. Every nation state.
every nation. Say the UN, sir. Don't just say the whole world because that's
It's
a bold generalization.
not every nation state or people have a vote in the UN.
Yeah, I'm very well aware of it, and
Well,
we can drill
that's why
down
I
to
said what I said.
we can drill down to the 152 nations that are part of that UN and how um, most of those nations are like Iran and all those other people that call for those horrible things that Israel has done. They they get nothing for war crimes, nothing. Yet they're wielding and dealing the the what the world says, as you say.
So the question comes back to, but you mentioned the fact that you said that I said it was justifiable for what happened in its entirety on 10/7. So here's what I'm trying to say, and I think I'm fair about this. I said that the individual acts against civilians were to be criticized and condemned and called war crimes as they are. Anytime a soldier was engaged, that's not a war crime. That's combatant. And so, to the extent that civilians were killed on the day, absolutely, I condemn that. And I think it's got to be horrific. I went through this at length with another person yesterday on a live and again today about all the awful things that have been dealt to the Israeli people based on what happened on 10/7. And that's perfectly legitimate to point out and be fair-minded about. But at the same time, I think it's also fair to point out, like Antonio Guterres said, speaking of the UN, he's the Secretary General, and he said that what happened on 10/7 was horrific, but we all know it didn't happen in a vacuum. And that's the point I'm trying to bring up. The American Indians, the American native population, is not living in an enclave that's blockaded by the U.S. forces, periodically bombed and unalived. It's not occupied by soldiers and checkpoints, and people getting killed, possibly put in jail, having their crops bulldozed, having their, all the stuff that goes on in that film, Life in Occupied Palestine. That's not happening.
But we have sequestered them to reservations with no food, with no water. So,
Yeah,
I
I'm
mean,
you're never going to get me to argue in favor of what's happened to the Native Americans. That's not. I mean, I'm disgusted by
I'm
what.
not asking you to. I'm not asking
No,
you to
I'm
argue.
agreeing with you that that's horrible. I'm just trying to say.
It's like, to me, it's like you're using this as a point, like, hey, these terrible things happened, but yet I don't think you understand, like, what to look at it, when you're sitting there calling Jewish people Zionist, and then you say, oh, I'm not being anti-Semitic because Zionist and
Not being.
Judaism is not the same. It's hard to have these conversations because
Well, let's do it this way.
one
I tell you what. I'll make you a commitment. Every time I say the word Zionist, here's what I'll say in front of it: the people who happen to be Jewish or even not Jewish, who believe in the political, settler, colonial, atheistic mindset of Zionism. I'll say
how
that.
about just saying Bibi and his Knesset? Is
Not
that
Bibi.
hard?
It's a lot broader than Bibi Netanyahu and his conservative on-court.
I mean, they're the ones wielding all this crazy stuff, wouldn't you say?
They're the worst of it, but they're certainly not the totality of it.
What's the totality of it?
All those people who support the current policies of the Israeli government vis-a-vis the ongoing occupation and blockade of Gaza and the bombing campaigns and ethnic cleansing that's taking place, and the land
As a
theft.
Jew, I don't support Bibi and I don't support his Knesset, but yet I'm still
Okay.
called a Zionist.
Well, do you believe in what's going on with the Israeli government as far as what it's doing, not just with Bibi, but in general over the last 7
Absolutely
decades?
not. Absolutely not.
Okay.
I've
Then
even
you may
had
not be a
family
Zionist
members
then.
protest it. So
You
absolutely
may
not.
not.
But I could,
Then you may
I
not be. If you're someone who's against what Israel do, you're not a Zionist. You're an anti-Zionist Jew. There are people called Jewish Voices for Peace. One of my best friends is in there, and he's somebody who does not believe in the state of Israel's behavior vis-a-vis Palestinians. Therefore, he's against what Israel does. He still is for Jewish people. He's still for the protection of the Jewish people. He's against what Israel does and how it came to be and what it's continuing to do to other peoples to its gain. That's a fair point to make. It doesn't make him an anti-Semite or a self-hating Jew. It makes him somebody who has observation and analytical skills and a heart. Maybe she had to take a break for a sec. Anyway, it's good to have people with different views. We can see that you can look at the same set of events and have a different interpretation, and that's fair. And I don't know about you. I don't want to make any Jewish person feel uncomfortable in analyzing this conflict. That is not the goal. And everyone who I've ever spoken to about this makes that differentiation very clearly. They're for the Palestinians having autonomy and a safe place to live on their own without any interference from the outside, while maintaining, of course, it's not attacking anybody. It's never been given that opportunity. And secondly, they differentiate between those who espouse the political settler colonial mentality, who continue them into this corner, and those people who just happen to follow Judaism or be ethnically Jewish who don't support that. That's a key differentiation. And it sounds like possibly that Onida doesn't support that. And if that case is, she's not a Zionist, because Zionists do support that. And if she doesn't, I commend her for not. It doesn't mean that if you're not a Zionist, you hate Jewish people. It means that you don't support the movement that's caused so much harm to others. So I hope that's a fair point to make. She may have dropped and she may have gotten frustrated, or maybe she had to go, or maybe the connection got bad. I didn't drop her. But anyway, listen, it's okay. Listen, if she is a Zionist and she supports some of what's going on, but not the most egregious nature of it with Netanyahu and company, that's fair. A lot of people fall into that category. It doesn't make them horrible people. It just means they're supporting something that has an incredibly negative impact on others to the gain of one group. And I don't think that that's something to be proud of. But I understand it. So, and again, if we're using the term Zionist, hopefully we'll say it in a way that's delineated along those lines, so it doesn't come across as meaning all Jewish people, because I certainly don't mean that. And so, I think on TikTok, what happens is a lot of very vociferous, loudmouth, arrogant, mean-spirited, closed-minded people come on who espouse the principles of Israel and Zionism, and we start to use disparaging language against those types of people. But most people aren't that. Most people are probably down the middle. I think Anita's more down the middle. She says she's of Hispanic heritage, but she's proud of her Judaism. She practices it regularly with her family, and I commend her for standing up for what she believes is right. And I do believe it's fair for her to say that when she goes outside or she's talking with her children, if they're wearing certain clothing that could cause problems for them, I mean, I can't imagine having to deal with that shit. So I'm very sympathetic to her in that regard. And I think that has zero to do with the nature of the conflict, other than the fact that I think the discomfort stems from people being so outraged at what they're seeing in terms of the behavior that's being done in response to 10/7 as being very disproportionate, outrageously criminal, and has a total disregard for human life. And that's what spurs the anger, as well as the ongoing injustice that's been in place for a long time. It's all part and parcel. But I don't believe it's hatred towards another people. And for people that say that the only reason this is going to continue is because the leaders of the H group hate Jewish people, I think they're sorely mistaken. Because as members have said, and leaders, if what happened in 1947 and subsequent to that was done by my cousin to me and my grandparents, I would be going after my cousin. And he's not Jewish. Okay? But remember, people feel what they feel because of their journey. And many people's journey does not include what I learned in 1989, and that's not their fault. It's just that I got exposed to that stuff. And I would imagine she sounded like a good person. And I think that it would be probably hard for somebody who wants to stay in the lane that she's in, if she were to encounter some of the stuff like Anna Balter and others. It's hard to accept things that tug at the carpet you're standing on. That's not her fault. We're all that way to some extent. But I think it's fair to stay open-minded. Hopefully she will. And I don't expect any changes, but I don't want her family to feel unsafe. And I don't have any animus towards her for being Jewish or anything else for that matter. So hopefully that's the case. Hopefully we're all that way. Because if you hate somebody for who they are or what they are, that's not fair. You got to give each person a chance to be who they are, obviously. And nobody's perfect, but we have to aspire to try our best. Okay. Did not see the Jake Tapper report. Did not see that. I've not been on the news this afternoon. Okay, so again, it's not about winning or losing. It's about being reasonable towards each other. There's someone named Your Favorite Doctor and Revolution. I'm going to bring in Your Favorite Doctor, and then, they dropped. So let's bring in Revolution. I don't want to hog all the airtime here.
Hey, Keith, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm okay. How are you?
Good, good. Do you know, you were spot on. Do you know what I mean? Zionism for me, and this is my view, and you know what I mean, that's what my Jewish friends tell me. I know I don't want it to be cliche, my Jewish friends, but Zionists are not Jews. And saying that Zionists are not Jews is protecting Judaism and Jewish people. It's like me as a Muslim, I believe that ISIS are not Muslim. They don't represent me or represent my views in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
And when people say that to me, I'm very, very happy. You know, it makes me happy to hear people saying that ISIS are not Muslims. Any Muslim who goes out blowing people up, you know, is not Muslim. Sorry, booing people, you know, is not Muslim. That makes me happy. Makes me happy. So Zionists are not Jews. Jews are a peaceful religious group who pray to God and spread a message like Christianity and Islam and Hinduism and Buddhism and Shintoism and all these religions is a message of peace. Love people, be nice to people, be nice to creation and what have you. You know, Netanyahu is not Jewish. Netanyahu, if he was Jewish once upon a time, he's lost actually his Jewishness. The day he picked up an arm and occupied a land and started unaliving innocent children and women, harvesting organs from unalived Palestinians illegally, occupying a brutal occupation, flattening Gaza and exhuming bodies from graveyards and turning them into a flatland to be built on. Do you know what I mean? He stopped being Jewish because Jewish people don't preach that kind of message. I mean, Judaism is one thing and Zionism is something else. And when a Jewish people becomes a Zionist, they lose their way. They're no longer Jewish people. And Zionism is an ideology, is a brutal ideology adopted by non-Jews as well. There are non-Jewish people who say, I'm a Zionist. So again, this in itself is proof that Zionism is not Judaism. Do you know what I mean? These are people who adopt an ideology that encourages occupation and a brutal occupation. And as you said, Chip, earlier, there are so many Jews actually who say, not in my name, because they're so frustrated. This is not us. These guys are destroying the reputation of my religion. The same way I felt as a Muslim in Morocco when I saw what ISIS were doing, and I was so frustrated and angry and unhappy because I say to myself, this is not my religion. These people are destroying the reputation of my religion. And it's very important that I stand up and I say, those guys don't represent me. They don't represent Islam in any way, shape or form, because there are 1.7 billion Muslims around the world who don't think like ISIS. If they did, this world would cease to exist. If they all go out and doing what ISIS did, we won't be around. The world would be chaos. And also,
Revolution, real quick, I apologize for jumping in. There was someone named Your Favorite Doctor that was trying to come up, and if others, sometimes it times out, and I can't do anything about it. It just circles and circles. So if you leave TikTok altogether, like exit the app, come back in and re-request, that usually fixes it. Sorry, please continue.
No, it's all right, Chip. And one last thing I want to say, the narrative today with Zionists is they want to turn this into a religious thing. Oh, this is no longer H group. This is Islam. This is Islam. It's not about Islam. It's not about Judaism. I mean, there are no records and no evidence of H group attacking Jews outside of Palestine. It's never happened. The Munich thing was not even H group. They didn't exist then. H group has never attacked Jewish people outside of Palestine. Their beef, their issue is with the occupation. I don't condone what happened to innocent civilians in October. Of course not. And you know what? It doesn't bother me if Israeli soldiers passed in October, serves them right, because they do worse to Palestinians.
Well, let me say one thing. And for those who were attacked on 10/7, in fairness to them, I'm sure they're probably happy to hear that no one outside Israel has been attacked, because it doesn't mean that Jews are the target, but they were still targeted on that day by a violent group. So it's not much consolation to their families and those who are angered by it.
Of course, mate. And I don't condone that. As a human being, I don't condone that. You know what I mean? But really, and I'm going to say one last thing, I'm going to drop a Chip, is this is not about religion. They will do anything to change the subject, because the elephant in the room is over 25 innocent women and children in Gaza are unalive because of the IDF. The issue is we've seen videos that went viral of the Israeli army, of the IDF. They're actually documenting their own crime. And they're all playing, doing all sorts of insane stuff, blowing up a building and gifting it to my fiance back home in Israel. Do you know what I mean? They're documenting their crimes. They're online. That's the issue. This is the subject, not the little things that they mention, to avoid the real facts that are online, that are documented. Do you know what I mean? And that is the issue. And that's Israel is an open book today, unfortunately, for you Zionists, because the world can see your crimes. We can all see what you've done. It's all online. Social media. This is the age of the internet and social media. And everything is documented, and it's going to be there on YouTube, on Google, and online for years and years and years to come. People will remember this. Sabra al-Shatila is not online. There was not much internet at the time. But the crimes that are happening now are online, Israel. Do you know what I mean? And you're going to face the music one day. Netanyahu, he's going to face the music one day. One day he's going to be in the docks facing a judge, a jury of his peers, and he's going to be judged for his crimes. Do you know what I mean? And this is what's going to happen. So H group have no beef with Jewish people. There's no evidence in the past and the present that they've actually attacked Jewish people outside of Palestine. Their beef is the brutal occupation, and it's the only resistance that the Palestinians have. You know, I'm Moroccan. There was a resistance against the French when we were a protection of France. George Washington, that's resistance against the English. If George Washington did not resist the brutal occupation of England in the US would not be free today. La Résistance Française, they resisted the Germans. Do you know what I mean? It's resistance. When you have oppression, you have resistance. You know, thanks, Jim. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I appreciate you.
Cheers.
Yeah, I think it's important to hear people repeat that over and over again. So we should be very careful to make that differentiation, because we don't want to be sounding like somebody who's anti-Semitic. That's silly, right? And that's not the point of all this. But the bottom line is this. I think the Netanyahu government miscalculated the following. Netanyahu's been around forever. Remember, he's lived mostly through the era of television. So his mindset is, I can do what I want. I got the backing of America. I can even manipulate them if I want to, and no one's going to really find out, so who the hell cares? I can just continue pounding these people into submission. That's his mindset. And unfortunately, what I don't think he calculated carefully enough, he knows he has this massive machine of Hasbara that does a really good job of managing the narrative, and it still does a good job to some extent, but it hasn't been able to be all-encompassing because of apps like TikTok. That's why Jonathan Greenblatt of the ADL said, we don't have a left-right problem. We have a young-old problem, and it's a TikTok problem. And so you see an effort to ban an app like this or force its sale to Western interests, primarily owned by somebody who's a professed allegiant to Israel and a Zionist, Stephen Mnuchin and others. That's concerning, right? It does appear to be sort of like stimulus response. So who knows? But the bottom line is this: that it hasn't been able to be contained. And so the biggest miscalculation is that people are now aware of what the Israeli government actually does and is willing to do to meet its objectives and sort of punish Palestinians as it wants to, as it has done for a long time. And that miscalculation is costing them dearly. And while they still may have the temporary political cover and military and money from the US, their standing in the world has dropped precipitously, to a point where my guess is that there's going to be a lot of push over the next decade to isolate and ostracize and marginalize the Israeli government, not the people. Nobody wants to see the average Israeli citizen harmed. And they're probably not radical people. They're probably more secular. They're probably not even that religious. They may go to a periodic holiday celebration here and there as a part of their culture, like people here celebrate Christmas, but they aren't super religious, that kind of thing. And that's the majority of people. Now, most people support Israel as their identity as a Jewish person, and they see that as sort of their duty as a part of the fabric of being from that group of people, that they support the entity. It's sort of all connected together. I think that's understandable. And they use the word Zionist to encompass that. But I don't think most who self-profess to be a Zionist fully understand the other elements of Zionism for which they unfortunately stand, maybe unknowingly, that involve a further expansion of settler colonialism and meting out horrible mistreatment towards others that are in the way of their objectives. And I think in that regard, it's not their fault. They see anybody criticizing Zionism as criticizing their Jewish identity. And that makes sense, right? But I think that's also not accurate. So therein lies the problem. So to those listening, who there may be the person that was on before, I apologize for forgetting, I think Onita, sorry. There's nobody's against Jewish people. And so if anybody ever does behave towards you in a way because you're Jewish, shame on them. And tell them that. You can tell them that I talked to this guy, Chip, and you shouldn't hate Jews. You should be mad at Zionism as a political settler colonial ideology that harms Palestinians. That's fair. That's exactly how people feel. That's how I feel. Is that fair? I hope that's a fair way to put it. Because I think if we said that every time, people couldn't say we're being anti-Semitic because we're clarifying exactly where we are criticizing. So fair enough. Enough said. Yeah, a lot of things are that way. People respond to what's done to them, not who the other person happens to be. All right. Now, she was trying to differentiate between a blockade, and because the blockade has been implemented because of security issues in the past, whether it be rocket fire, whether it be people who are working in Israel coming in and doing bad things that they don't like, a terror act, whatever it may be. But if you're creating a blockade, it is a blockade. The U.S. still navally blockades Cuba. After all these decades, because of the missile crisis, it has maintained a naval blockade, and therefore the U.S. decides what does or doesn't get into Cuba or out. So what has that done to Cuba? It's totally changed their ability to run an economy, obviously, if the U.S. strangles it to a point like that. So that's why they don't have brand new cars in Cuba. That's why they don't have all sorts of modern things, because the U.S. hasn't allowed it in. Why do you think that the West Bank and Gaza have not developed more? That one of the things we hear all the time as an argument is, well, these people are less sophisticated. Look what we've done in Israel. Look what they've done over there. Not a fair comparison, because your military is controlling and choke pointing the variability of somebody to make their own choices and behave in a way that, also the checkpoints. These are strangle points, bottlenecks that make it impossible for people to make normal transportation and movement possible. I can't tell you how upsetting it is to somebody like me to try to see how people live under these conditions and somehow try to have it justified by the other group as just being peaceful. It's not peaceful. So, anyway, just check it out for yourself. I mean, I have no reason to make this stuff up. Most people who tell you you're naive, indoctrinated, are themselves naive and indoctrinated. That's just what I've come to learn over time. So, just take it for what it's worth, and then just ask people. So you're somebody who likes to think you have a good balanced set of information. Oh yeah. Okay, well, were you willing to check this out? Oh yeah, and then they don't do it, and then they're not willing to do it, and just leave them alone. The person we had on earlier, who's the person who talked about travel, that's the kind of person you want to talk to, because they're going to entertain some information, or at least be open to it. And they're the people that are best to talk to, because they're going to form a new awareness that they didn't have before, and they'll be like, damn, as others have after October 7th. Most people were not aware of the extent to which Israel does what it does to Palestinians before October 7th. They had a rudimentary understanding of it like I did. So it makes a big difference. No, I'm not saying that nobody, I put it this way, Lynn, I shouldn't have said that word. Lynn makes a good point. She says, I respect you, yet I wish you would stop saying that nobody hates the Jews. It's not true. Fair enough. There are definitely people who are bigoted, anti-Semitic, who blame Jews for problems of society, as we've seen in previous generations, previous cultures. And there are people that just are like supremacist type thinkers with their particular group. And they look down on other people, or they blame people for stuff where it's just not fair. So yeah, good point, fair point. What I should have said is the overwhelming majority of people who criticize what's happening with Israel don't do it because of one's religion or ethnicity, happen to be Jewish or Judaism. They do it because they're upset with the political settler colonial movement and actions, the negative impactful actions of Zionism. Most of which is done not with Judaism, although it's co-opted it, but people who don't even believe in the religion. They wanted to use it as a vehicle within which to move and settle into a territory that was not unoccupied. It was occupied. Hopefully that's a fair recategorization of that. Well, listen, it's not about, I'm not trying to overwhelm anybody or win. Somebody says, don't challenge me. I don't look at it as a challenge. This isn't a battle. What we're doing here is just trying to hopefully exchange ideas, learn from each other, and come to a better, well-rounded understanding. She kept saying that I was she kept making the allegation that I seem to be very one-sided. So, as I like to say, I would absolutely love to be able to compliment something that the IDF, the Israeli government, or the state of Israel does in general. And if and when they give me something to work with on that regard, I will praise it to the end of days. I want to say nice things about every group of people. Somebody's doing things that I think are reprehensible and they would not want to have done to themselves, and I certainly wouldn't want them done to me, I think it's fair to point that out, and hopefully in an unbiased way as best as possible. I understand the point of view that Israel wants to forward its security needs. I get it. I just don't agree with it putting those needs so far ahead of the very life of some other people and the misery they put them through in order to say they're maintaining their security, unnecessarily so, I believe. Alabaman, can you do it? Yeah, I'll bring you up. We have another guest that's going to come up. What's up? How you doing?
Hey Chip, it's an honor for me to come up on your panel. Thank you very much, first of all. And second of all, Chip, I would like to know your opinion about the Moscow attacks a few days ago. Thank you.
Yeah, well, first of all, they were horrific. If you don't know what happened, gunmen came into a concert hall where young people were waiting primarily to watch a concert, and they just unleashed this horrific barrage against anybody and everybody. And I think it's up to 130 people now that have been confirmed unalived, and over 100 others injured, or something in that neighborhood. But whatever number it is, now the media, the U.S. media, immediately said it was attributable to ISIS, which is very convenient, right? Now, the people who perpetrated the crime were caught, but they were fleeing back towards the Ukrainian border, presumably to go back inside of Ukraine. So the assumption is that perhaps this was initiated either through the Ukrainian government or other security agencies related to the coalition supporting Ukraine.
Yeah, exactly. So, Chip, do you also believe this was like some kind of distraction from the CIA and the Mossad to like try to get Russia fighting on two fronts, like on the Ukrainian side and in the Middle East? Because I
Well,
do believe
yeah,
they're
let me
trying to.
let me elaborate on that. So, for those of you who don't know, Russia has had troops in Syria, especially their air force, for a long time, working to help protect the survival of the Assad government. Now, recently, the Israelis were doing skirmishes inside of southern Lebanon, and there were some Israel, in Syria, and inside of Syrian airspace. If the Israelis go inside a Syrian airspace, they're fair game for the Russians to engage with, and that has happened. So there's a potential conflict there. Now, as
Yeah.
far as what's happened in terms of the terrorist act. I believe, and again, my first thought was this is an attempt. Again, what the U.S. has tried to do was initially bait Vladimir Putin into having a conflict in Ukraine. That worked. Now, what they're trying to do is to bait him into a broader response that will allow Article 5 to be triggered, which brings in all of NATO since the Ukrainians are getting absolutely pummeled by the Russians. And there's a no win forecast without additional forces from other places. And it's such a sensitive issue because if the U.S. initiates it or the West initiates it, it then is the initiator of World War III. They're trying to draw the Russians to instigate it to give the U.S. and its allies a chance to fight back against quote unquote Russian aggression.
Exactly, because Chip, I mean, I don't even believe it was the IS group. I mean, if you look at the whole thing, I just believe they are doing this to distract them from other wars and all that, and especially for the Russians. I mean, I did hear about CIA and Mossad things. I cannot confirm it, but I don't believe it was IS. So just what you said, yeah, I agree with you, Chip. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I appreciate it. These are kind of things that are going on. And again, by the way, just to let you know, the first thing you ever hear about something is almost never the reason. And how did the U.S. know so quickly who it was? How did they know for sure? I mean, that's a fair question to ask, right? So it's a lot of times what happens is when these type of actions are perpetrated, there's a story and a narrative already in place before it happens. This is what we're going to go with. This is what we're going to run on this one. And so this is unfortunately a common set of tactics by some of the Western powers, usually engineered by the United States and its intelligence agencies. Somebody says I should be careful. Well, listen, I'm surmising. I don't know for sure. Other people speak to this as well. They say similar things. You know, it just seems like it just doesn't seem like something that would just be random and out of the blue. Like, why did this happen? Again, the way I like to look at things is who benefits and what can be permitted to happen afterwards. Look at 10/7. What then happened after 10/7? It opened the floodgates up for this huge Israeli response. Okay, well, can you say that it was just some magical out of the blue thing, or do you suspect there may be something other involved? I don't know, but these are things that come to mind when you start looking at putting puzzle pieces together. And when something doesn't make sense, there's usually a reason why it doesn't make sense. But when something does make more sense, it makes more sense. That's it. So in terms of being careful, I don't know. Listen, I'm a guy on TikTok with 115,000 followers. Not to diminish anybody who's here, but I'm a minnow. So I guess what's the point? I mean, I have no reach. So if I had 30 million people I was talking to, like Tucker Carlson, that'd be totally different. But let's see what he has to say. He tends to talk about some things now that are different than he used to talk. But we'll see. Emily says the U.S. is going to fail. I don't know what you mean by that, like in terms of what. But other people have talked about the current capability of the U.S. military and what it can or can't. Sit down. Hey, sit down. Okay, that's Ruby. Okay. So anyway, we'll see. We'll see. I don't know what you mean by America's going to fail. I don't know if you mean in terms of what they're doing in Israel or what they're doing in terms of general. I don't know what you mean by that. But anyway, okay. There was somebody that wanted to pop up, but then they just dropped out. So we're going to go with that. So if there's any other guests that want to talk, I'm happy to have you up pretty soon. Yeah, she's a cute dog, huh? I'm going to look at the comments for some questions here or statements and see if I can react to some of that. But again, I don't have evidence to back up anything that I'm sharing because if I did, why would I have that? But it's just from watching these events historically, you start to see patterns. And once you break from the Western corporate media machine, and you start discounting everything they say, almost always the things they say is not what's going on. And all you have to do is go back to WMD and go from there. Okay, 2 people in the guest box. We have, by the way, there's someone coming up named Hublai Khan. If you're here, please listen to this person. This person has an awful lot of good information to share with the world. I'm very impressed by this person.
Good evening.
Hey,
Well, I don't know if you discussed this tonight or not because I'm just in, but there's been a lot of analytical talk by well-known Indian and Greek and other neutral defense analysts about what happened with respect to this attack on Moscow.
okay.
Um, and I tend to watch India analysts the most because they've been the most neutral in both Ukraine and Mideast conflicts.
Yeah,
They
makes sense.
explain it pretty well.
Yeah.
There's a General Bakshi, retired general from India, who has consistently given the most detailed briefings on the Ukraine war, for instance, and pretty much called things a month in advance of everything that's happened.
Wow.
Other geopolitical analysts over there seem to be willing to call, they'll make a list, like, for instance, for this attack on Moscow, one analyst listed 5 possible suspects in a case for or against each of the 5. Like,
Right.
it just seems like a pretty open environment there to discuss geopolitical matters. One of the things that was most important, and this was raised, I think, by Alex Christoforou, the Greek analyst, was that a very short time ago there was a foiled attack on a Moscow synagogue, and the Russian security services intercepted it.
Hmm.
And that had that attack succeeded, it would have been very useful in propaganda to claim that Russia was inadequately protecting its Jewish population, would have been a way to kind of encourage Israel to push for more emigration of Russian Jews to Israel to replace the people who are leaving Israel right now. It would have fit into a narrative that that Putin is out of control of the internal security of his country and all kinds of things like that.
Yeah.
But as you just said, when you start looking at the real deep history of some of these matters, you'll notice patterns. And there is a pattern, and that was a pattern in the 50s, certainly in the 40s, that Mossad would conduct operations that would terrorize the Jewish populations in some other countries, notably in Iraq and in Morocco, and basically encourage people to move to Israel as a way to be safe. And if this attack on Moscow had succeeded, it might have been something else, arguably, in that pattern.
Hmm.
So if that's an explanation one is inclined to believe about that attempted synagogue attack, and if you also are inclined to believe that ISIS-K is a product of CIA and Mossad maneuvering against Assad, which many people do believe about ISIS/Daesh, which is the Arabic name for it, then it becomes very possible to believe that they just tried something else through another usual suspect proxy. And if that's the case, then you could expect maybe more of these attacks. Now, I don't think this is in response to that, but a coincidental geopolitical event happening at the same time as Russia and China has made a deal with the Houthis to essentially get safe passage for their own ships
Smart.
carrying their cargoes. A deal, obviously, which does not extend to any of Israel's allies, certainly not the US, the UK, and other NATO countries that went to try to forcibly attack the Houthis and stop them from stopping the Israeli genocide. There was also an attack by Houthi forces on Eilat today or yesterday, and that was a capability they didn't previously have to hit that port city. So it seems there may already be weapons flow there. It seems that the Saudis, having decided not to mess with the Houthis anymore after 10 years of ineffectively bombing them,
Yeah.
and then the Saudis having come to a rapprochement deal brokered by China to end hostilities with Iran. One thing many people may not be aware of is that the Saudis were bankrolling as many as 20 operations throughout the Mideast, everywhere, to specifically counter Iranian-backed Shia groups. And then they just stopped doing that. in the last 2 years. And groups like the Houthis and Hezbollah and so on that are typically Shia aligned, there was some kind of deal cut between Saudi and Iran, like maybe leave the Persian Gulf alone and don't support Bahraini or Qatari or Omani rebel groups, and in return for just leaving our backyard alone, um, we're not going to mess with you. Generally, we don't know what the terms are of the deal between the Saudis and Iran, but when you see
Right.
Russia and China backing the Houthis, it's pretty clear that Iran and Saudi must also both be okay with that transfer. So if one reads this in the biggest possible way, it's a transfer of security in the Suez Canal and to Egypt away from the old sea power guarantors, the US and the UK, and
Mm-hmm.
towards the hypersonic missile providers, China and Russia.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the really interesting events, there's a channel called What's Going On with Shipping that I follow,
Hmm.
and a few other shipping focus analysts, and they'll all tell you that the most significant geopolitical event was that a country without a navy managed to interdict one of the world's most important waterways, that being the Bab el Mandeb. And when you don't need a navy to stop a navy, that is a completely different geopolitical ballgame. That means that the players are totally different on the table now. It's like if you've got an invincible shore defense, like a whole lot of hills and mountains, and you've got a view of that strait, you can't be defeated. And the one of the important events to analogize it to is the attempt by the English to force the Dardanelles in 1915, right? They wanted to get into the Black Sea, but the Turks had such good shore defenses, cannons built into mountains and so on, that they simply could not get the British Army past the Dardanelles into the Black Sea. The Gallipoli was a fiasco for the British, and it was a major loss, major geopolitical loss. And now we may be seeing a Gallipoli level event happening in Bab el Mandeb, meaning to this day, Turkey in 1936 signed the Montreux Convention, which gave it essentially was a recognition that Turkey had exclusive control of who got in and out of the Black Sea, with some, guarantees made
Can
about
we bring it?
management.
Can we bring it forward to current? Most people would love to hear this, but I think we're kind of short on time for the details.
Sure, yeah. I'm just analogizing the situation to today. We have
Right.
now got Egypt in that position where it was building this camp, presumably under American and Israeli pressure, to, arguably temporarily, but nobody thinks it's temporary, evacuate the Gaza civilian population to. Now they have to face the fact that their only business coming through the Suez is going to be Chinese, Russian, and Chinese and Russian sponsored traffic, and everything else is going to be interdicted by the Houthis.
Yeah.
So if Egypt wants to keep getting Suez Canal fees, it might have to rethink who its superpower allies are. The pressure on Egypt is now going to be rather immense from its own population and from its own treasury to essentially accept this new normal. And if it doesn't, then what's it going to do? Actively enter the conflict, back the US and the UK against its own population's wishes? I mean, that is key. All eyeballs should be over at Suez, at Eilat, and what's happening with Egypt right now.
Yeah, that's
Just
a good point.
noticing that shift.
Didn't think about that. That's a really good point. So, is it possible that? Do you think that? Wait, Brandon, we got an echo. Yeah, thanks. Is it possible that the Russians or the Chinese might help subsidize that deficit so it doesn't tilt the balance?
If I was China, I would certainly do that, but not in direct cash terms necessarily.
Right.
Maybe in technological access terms, arms terms. It seems very clear that neither China nor Russia intends to have any long-term relationship with the state of Israel, and maybe they see that there will be no state of Israel, and they're positioning for a relationship with a future state, a unified single state of Palestine. But I don't think there were very considerable arms deals between Israel and China. And if
Yeah.
China is willing to simply throw those away to make a deal with the Houthis, that means their understanding of the geopolitical future has shifted very considerably from where it was even 2, 3 years ago. In Russia, despite the fact that Netanyahu blamed the USSR for all world terrorism in the 1980s and relentlessly led a campaign to overturn many important Russian allies like Assad and so on for years, despite that, Russia and Israel have retained pretty cordial ties. That now appears to be over. So if only for the the sake of the large population of Russian-born Jews in Israel, it now looks like that's severed, that's off. Maybe Putin will even issue an open invitation to those people to move back to Russia, to move back to Ukraine. Maybe he'll even offer them weapons to go take Odessa and Lvov away because the Nazis drove them out in the first place. I mean, anything's on the table now geopolitically because Russia and China have so openly backed the Houthis in this conflict with Israel. So I just wanted to note that's a really major event.
Yeah, you're right. That's a big shift in terms of kind of being allegiances being clearly defined and delineated. So that's yeah, it's interesting. I think this whole new BRICS / realignment of the military systems has really been fascinating to watch. And I think it's going to play out in a rather dramatic way at some point. Interesting stuff. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That was amazing. I appreciate it. You're welcome to stay up if you want to stay. I'm going to give Random Dude a chance to come on. How you doing, Random Dude?
I'm doing well, man. Great being here. I want to add a couple of things as well. Like one of the things we heard during the start of after the 10-7 was the whole Ben Gurion Canal, which was supposed to be run parallel in Suez and sort of reduce the importance of Suez Canal. I mean, that plan right now is sort of worthless because if you're bottlenecked by somewhere else, it's semi-worthless because now basically there is like, okay, there's a blockade here. Doesn't matter what canal you create there, you're still bottlenecked by the Houthis. So it sort of throws a wrench in this whole plan altogether. So, and we don't hear anything about it anymore. I think that's part of the reason they realize, well, that's sort of narrow range was sort of guaranteed to be open. Now it's not. So that's one thing. Also, in terms of security guarantees, if you there's all like the whole ISIS thing happened like a couple of months ago in Iran as well. Same group, just very under dubious circumstances, which again seems like very related. And again, there was a conversation that US sort of warned Iran as well. So similar pattern, not much talked about in the Western media, but it looks very sort of similar in that sense. And you look, I think a month after that, there was like a security guarantee contract between Iran and Russia, which I think is basically, again, goes along with this thing that the lines are being drawn more and more and sort of alliances being sort of made more clear. So yeah, it's interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting next year. The future since post-pandemic has been amazingly different than pre. I think that's going to be a big shift in world history is, pre-2019 and post-2019, including the financial system. There's a lot of cracks in the financial system that aren't being talked about right now, and huge amounts of leverage and debt that are getting dangerously high like they did in 2007 and 8, and especially in 1999. So yeah, thanks for contributing that. And, I want to see if there's anybody else who wants to come up. We were talking earlier about the differentiation between Zionism and Judaism, or people who happen to be Jewish, and the term Zionism. So I just want to make sure everybody kind of goes by that delineation, because it's kind of, I think we risk, in terms of being so critical sometimes of Zionism, so outspoken, that it can be lumped in with people who are anti-Semitic, even though we know that we're not being anti-Semitic. It's good to put in those clarifiers. It takes away the ammunition for others to say that. So with people like, Rabbi Shmuley and this guy, Rabbi Barclay, kind of clamping down and saying, well, only we get to determine, meaning us Jewish people get to determine what the meaning of anti-Semitism is, and it can change according to what we perceive it to be. Okay, well, then we have to go out of our way to make statements such that they cannot be misinterpreted that way, whatever goalposts tend to shift. So I think that's fair, although it is a mouthful to make all those statements, but I think it's fair to point out. Maybe I'll put a background on my thing that explains it with like a disclaimer, so I don't keep saying it. Just refer to the background.
Yeah, I want to add, actually, I want to say something to that. As I was on your live yesterday, and there was this lady, I forgot her name, but was saying, yeah, you talk about Zionism here, but back in the Middle East, nobody differentiates it. I grew up in Iran, and from the early age, every time, and Iran has a very anti-Israeli sort of background or setup, but every single time they referred in our course book, in our TV, all of that, to Zionist regime, basically like in the actual native languages, Sehuni regime or something, right? So Sehionism is Zionism, it's an Arabic word. But pretty much there was a very clear distinction between Judaism and Zionism in Middle East, at least in Iran, very, very clear distinction. And I didn't understand as much of a difference when I was a kid. I learned more about it when I came to United States, maybe 20 years ago or something. But within the Middle East, there is a clear distinction, at least the areas that are not actively in sort of conflict. There is a clear distinction between Zionism and Judaism. And we had Jewish people in my class, and that distinction was sort of made very clear to us, that you have to be very respectful of Jewish people. There's a difference. I didn't know the difference as a teenager or as a young adult, but that distinction was made very clear to us, that you should not be disrespectful. And a lot of the whole anti-Semitic tropes that people say, or all these sort of things that people say about Jewish people and all of that, I did not know about it until I came to United States. All those anti-Semitic tropes were sort of more popular or more sort of talked about within the Western culture for me, rather than back in Iran. So I want to just refute that. People say, well, you're like, when Zionists come to say, yeah, you don't know what's happening there in the Middle East and blah, blah, blah. They just use the people not knowing what's going on in the Middle East to paint this type of picture. Just want to make that clear. So.
Yeah, I want to respond to a comment. Thanks for bringing that up. There's someone named Joe in the comments, and he wrote down, I don't know if this is to troll or if it means this. He says, Zionism is Judaism. So let me share my understanding. And Joe, if I'm wrong, please come up here. You can correct me. I know a lot of people will say that or feel that, but in strict definitional terms, if you go back and study the founding of the Zionist movement, we can bring it up on the computer if you like. But it talks about the founder, the original conversation, Theodor Herzl, and when he died, handing the torch to Chaim Weizmann and others. It says that Zionism is a political settler ideology that is absent a religious goal. It's for the ethnic Jewish population to create a homeland, in this case, in historic Palestine. So it doesn't include the religious aspect of it. Now, I know in some cases, people who happen to be Jewish ethnically also consider themselves of the Jewish faith or practice Judaism, but not always. And it wasn't for Herzl either. He was not a practicing member of Judaism. And so therefore, what people seem to observe or seem to make I guess you'd say an allegation of, is that those who were not theistic, they didn't actually study the Jewish religion, but they use it as a cloak to cover its tracks, saying that criticism of its endeavors and aims as a political settler movement, a colonial movement, is criticism of Jewish people and Judaism. And that's the difference. We try to peel that away. Everybody, Ben Shapiro's of the world, want to put all that together, as well as his personal identity. And it's one big interwoven thing of being Jewish, practicing Judaism, being a Zionist. It's all together, and none of it can be taught, because any conversation on any of it is anti-Semitic. And that's awfully convenient if you put it that way. But to those of us who sit on the outside looking in, I certainly don't see it that way. And I think it's really important for people who do feel that way to understand that we're not trying to be mean-spirited by pulling it apart that way. We're trying to be fair towards the behavior and the ideology that drives that behavior that is so negatively impactful to others is worthy of criticism or condemnation, or at least conversation. And it doesn't mean anyone's attacking the people who happen to embrace the ideology per se, but we're talking about the worst excesses of it, not the establishment of a homeland per se, but the other excesses that brutally mistreat others, that try to take more land that perceptibly may be somebody's long-term vision when it's not theirs to take. And it was created by some other party forcibly imposing an artificial delineation on a territory that had a very wide variety of human beings of different ethnicities and religions, which caused disruption to an extent that the violence that it has been accompanied by has continued to this day. And my guess will continue until something more realistic and practical emerges that doesn't quite so inflame the tensions, rightly so, of the people involved. So hopefully that covers that. We've got about 10 minutes left here. If anybody else wants to come up, we have another guest that just popped into the queue. Let me see here who this is. This is OG4359. So let's see what OG original something or other would like to share with us.
Chip, hello,
Hello.
Chip. How
Hi
are you
there.
doing today?
Okay, thanks. How are you?
Great. The only thing that I always think of, not just the fact that it's, anti-Semitic comments or anything like that, it's the environment, that's the receptive environment to that. Okay, that's what they created, which in a way, it enforces the consequences of bringing any comments that they deem anti-Semitic. So it's a bigger issue than it's just whether the comment is anti-Semitic or not. It's a system that it's meant to just kind of tax people and just silence people, and it just so basically it's very hard to really kind of like quabble over what's anti-Semitic or what's not, unless that environment doesn't exist or that environment is cleaned up. You know, that's all I have to say. So thank you for
Okay.
allowing me to.
Thanks for being here. I appreciate that. So I just want to let the audience know, I do my lives. Sometimes I do impromptu ones like today, but usually I do them on a set schedule. So it's every Wednesday this is all Eastern time, from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. And then on Saturdays, I do a longer form one from 12 noon to usually 3 or 4 p.m., sometimes longer. So what I prefer to do, if possible, is have people come up who disagree about whatever issues or whatever positions that I take, and then we can have an informative and civil conversation. It gets heated sometimes. We had somebody on earlier who got pretty upset, thinking that I'm not being open-minded enough or whatever. That's fair. I try to be, and I try to be civil and polite. That's the key to these things, is not talk over each other. And I think that this live is sort of something that follows that standard, but doesn't always work out the way we want it to. I was on one this morning where it was literally Jerry Springer, and you can't even hear who's saying what. It's just, I don't think that's very productive. So anyway, I think I'm going to shut it down right now, if you don't mind, because I've been on for quite a while. So I do want to thank everybody who came up as a guest, and for the audience for being here. Thank you so much. I have a link in my bio. It just says Linktree Chip Barnes. This is recorded, and it'll be posted up on my YouTube and my Rumble channels in a little bit here once I do it. If you want to check it out, I've recorded all my lives, so they're all on there. Recently, we've had Senate candidates on there. Senate candidate Diane Sayre, who's running for the Senate in New York. If you want to check her out, it's sayreforsenate.com. Nice person, good, all the boxes checked as being a good person for peace and against all the machinery we're seeing, all the corporate takeover. She's just not somebody who's going to take AIPAC money, that kind of stuff. So hopefully you can support candidates like Diane Sayre. But that's all I have for tonight. I thank everybody for being here. Thank you so much, and I will see you next time. I appreciate you. Thank you.